Welcome to Scandalcast. In this video, we will be breaking down episode 3 of Hulu's The Dropout, recapping the major events in this episode and discussing how accurately they describe what actually happened in real life. The title of this episode is Green Juice, something that was known to be Holmes's signature drink. In a real interview that was depicted back in episode 1, Holmes was asked, "If you are what you eat, what are you?" And she responded, "Green juice." The drink is used as a plot point in this episode to symbolize Elizabeth's transformation into the black turtleneck wearing, green juice drinking Elizabeth Holmes the world would come to know. The episode begins with a scene of Holmes going nuts at the release of the first iPhone. I doubt this happened, but we know she was obsessed with Steve Jobs, and she said she wanted the Theranos device to be the iPod of healthcare. This scene symbolizes her Apple obsession, which ties into one of the episode's topics, how she hired away a bunch of former Apple employees. Anna Ariola is based on a real person. The real Ariola was a product designer at Apple who had worked on the iPhone. She gave up 15,000 shares of Apple stock to join Theranos as the chief design officer, only to resign 4 months later after being disturbed that the still unreliable Theranos devices had been used in a validation trial with terminal cancer patients. The device wasn't used to make any medical decisions, but Elizabeth hadn't told this to the staff. The real Ariola did encourage Holmes to dress more like a CEO, and, interesting little tidbit, in real life she gave Elizabeth Holmes the name of the designer of Steve Jobs' turtlenecks, and we all know what happened after that. Holmes also hired a couple more Apple employees who resigned soon after Ariola, but not all at the same time as depicted on the show. However, one of them really did leave Holmes a book called The No A-Hole Rule and another book called Beyond Bullshit, Straight Talk at Work, along with a scathing resignation letter condemning the culture of dishonesty at Theranos. Avi Tevanian is also based on a real person. Tevanian was one of Steve Jobs' closest friends, who had worked with him since the 1980s at Next Computer, and who was regarded as Steve Jobs' right-hand man at Apple. Holmes convinced him to join her board. The real Tevanian kept asking tough questions about why the device never seemed to come any closer to working, and why Elizabeth Holmes never produced the pharmaceutical company contracts she kept claiming were in process. He unsuccessfully tried to convince Don Lucas that something was up. Many people did view Don Lucas as treating Elizabeth Holmes like a granddaughter. The real Don Lucas did have brunch with Holmes every weekend at his home in Atherton. Rather than listen to Tevanian, Don Lucas forced Avi Tevanian off the board as per Elizabeth's wishes. As depicted on the show, Richard Fuse did file a patent for a mechanism to alert doctors of an abnormal test result, then pettily emailed the patent to the general email address on Theranos' website, where no one noticed it for months. Elizabeth would have had to pay him off to use a similar mechanism in her device. The way Elizabeth Holmes' family found out about the patent wasn't as dramatic as depicted on the show. In real life, Noelle Holmes went to visit Lorraine Fuse for lunch one day, and Richard decided to join them. He made a suspicious comment in a sing-song voice about how easy it was for a company like Theranos to be taken advantage of, but didn't say anything about the patent he had filed. The Holmeses immediately suspected he was up to something, and the relationship between the two families, including Noelle and Lorraine's friendship, quickly deteriorated. Richard's patent was discovered months later by a random employee at Theranos. By that point, the Fuses and the Holmeses were no longer speaking. Elizabeth responded by filing a lawsuit against Fuse. The episode also depicts how the environment at Theranos became more secretive and intimidating. It is true that Elizabeth's administrative assistants would friend Theranos employees on Facebook and report what they posted back to Elizabeth. Holmes also began siloing departments from each other, requiring card access everywhere, and blocking chat ports so that people in different departments couldn't instant message each other. She claimed it was to protect intellectual property, the rationale being that if she was the only one who knew the big picture, then no one could run off with Theranos' ideas. But it also meant that no one knew the true state of the Theranos device except for her and eventually Sunny, which would ultimately better allow them to carry out their scam. The trip Edmund Coup and Elizabeth Holmes took to Nashville was real, and the real Edmund Coup did become disturbed and uncomfortable to see that they were testing their still unreliable device with visibly ill terminal cancer patients. The devices given to the patients were very sensitive to temperature, as described on the show, and often malfunctioned. In real life, Pfizer was ultimately disappointed in the results of the trial and chose to end their collaboration with Theranos. But Elizabeth went on to famously doctor documents that made it look like Pfizer had comprehensively validated the product and given it glowing reviews. In her criminal trial, it was revealed that she had pasted Pfizer logos on documents that Theranos had written themselves and passed the documents off to future corporate partners and investors as a glowing Pfizer endorsement. The character Brendan Morris in this episode is not a real person, but it is true that the real Elizabeth Holmes hired a rival team of engineers and pitted them against Edmund Cou's team to see who could come up with a working device first. Edmund Coup, if you recall, was the chief engineer, but he began to notice that Holmes was making engineering hires without consulting him, and the new engineers weren't reporting to him. The rival engineering team came up with a device based on the design of a glue dispensing robot. Holmes called the new design the Edison because, she said, they had tried everything else and this was the only thing that worked. Elizabeth then laid off Edmund Cou's entire engineering team. In real life, sadly, Edmund Cou's firing was as heartbreaking as depicted on the show. He was bustled out of the office so quickly that he left many things behind, including his favorite X-Acto knife. And he really was stranded outside the office for over an hour because he hadn't driven his car to work that day. These were the days before Uber. An employee who spotted him standing outside from outside a window found another employee to give him a ride home. In this scene, Ian Gibbons makes some points about how the new Gluebot design was not based on microfluidics, the cutting-edge technology of manipulating microscopic amounts of liquid, which had been the foundation of Holmes's original vision and the Theranos 1.0 machine. Instead, the Edison just miniaturized existing lab bench techniques and had a robotic arm mimic the movement a human would make at the lab bench. This change in direction was a crucial one in the story of Theranos that would ultimately affect their ability to succeed. In real life, Holmes's first ever employee, who had been with her at Channing Robertson's lab at Stanford, an individual named Shanak Roy, whom I believe the character Rakesh is loosely based on, resigned from Theranos at this point because they were no longer working on the cutting-edge technology he had originally signed up for. The subplot of Sunny and Elizabeth experiencing relationship drama that is resolved by her allowing him to become part of her work life is a made-up subplot. In the episode, Sunny emotionally abuses Elizabeth, telling her that she looks like crap, trying to force her to drink green juice, and they have an argument that turns somewhat physical. It appears that the producers chose, to some extent, to believe Elizabeth's allegations that Sunny was abusive towards her, allegations that Sunny, of course, strongly denied. Sunny did reportedly make notes on how she should talk and what she should eat and told her, "I have molded you," notes and texts that Elizabeth presented in court as evidence of abuse. But there was a lot of contradictory evidence as well, evidence that showed that she was the one in charge, that she often ignored his advice, and that she made the final decisions. There is also no evidence that Sunny was the one that introduced her to her signature green juice. Holmes did really face a vote of no confidence from the board and ultimately convinced them to let her stay. In real life, after two more senior executives came to Don Lucas with the same concerns as Avi Tevanian, he could no longer ignore the issue and held a vote. However, the show kind of intertwines this event with the subplot about Holmes's relationship problems with Sonny in a way that used a lot of creative license. Sonny did loan $12 to $14 million to Theranos at a time when they were facing considerable financial hardship, and he did eventually come on as COO. But it wasn't part of some magnificent strategy Holmes came up with to save herself from being ousted, as portrayed in this episode. In real life, Elizabeth just made an appeal to the board over the course of 2 hours that the book Bad Blood described as using a combination of contrition and charm that left members of the board very impressed, and they changed their minds and allowed her to stay. It had nothing to do with her bringing Sonny on board, which in real life didn't happen until more than a year later. Nevertheless, the ending of this episode, in my opinion, does a magnificent job of symbolizing what was to come at Theranos after this point. After Holmes survived the coup attempt, she immediately fired the senior executives who had tried to oust her. By the end of 2009, all the people Holmes had hired from elite companies like Apple and Intel were gone. In fact, her entire senior executive staff had been overturned, and she never even bothered to replace some of them. Instead, she brought on Sonny, her secret boyfriend, as her number two, and proceeded to live in an isolated bubble where she listened to no one but him. The two of them would then embark on a tyrannical joint rule that would ultimately end in scandal and ruin. That brings us to the end of our episode 3 recap. If you enjoyed the video and would like to be alerted of future recaps, don't hesitate to like and subscribe and ring the bell, and thank you for watching Scandalcast.